Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're worshiping, in your home or on your TV, laptop or phone, you are a part of this family. And you could watch or listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists, search for past messages, and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to the Cornerstone America's podcast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoy the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family. All right, let's get into the message this morning. We're in a series called Believe. And we're looking at the 7 miracles found in the Gospel of John. John wrote his gospel around 7 miracles that would reveal more of who Jesus is and what he came to do and about his mission and helping us understand his power and authority and identity. And we've been walking through these. The first one we did was Jesus changing water to wine. And this is really about Jesus being the source of joy and transformation, that he can take something ordinary and make it extraordinary. He has power over nature, revealing part of who he is. And then the second miracle we looked at was the healing of the nobleman's son. This is about Jesus' words carry divine power, and he could speak the word and somebody from a distance off would be healed. It's the power of his word and the authority that he has. And then the third healing that we looked at, third miracle, and really John calls these signs, right? They're signs pointing to who Jesus is and pointing to what he wants to do. And so the third one was a healing of a man by a pool. And this is about Jesus as the helper to the helpless, that this man had been in this condition for 38 years, was hopeless, helpless, and Jesus comes in there and changes his life. And then the fourth one was the feeding of the 5,000, which we talked about last week, where Jesus is the bread of life, that he meets our physical needs, but it goes much deeper. It's also about meeting our spiritual needs. And so that's what that story was about. And really, John chapter 6, if you read the whole chapter, there's a lot in there. And we're going to still be in there today. And there's still a lot more. After we cover what we covered today, there's still a lot more in there. But Jesus walking on water, talking about Jesus is the Lord over creation. That Jesus demonstrates his power over nature and over chaos, over the physical laws, but he's got the power over even the storms of life that we encounter. And so this is what this miracle is about. So let me start with this question for you this morning. What are you afraid to face? What are you afraid of? The miracle that we're talking about today, I think, begs this question that what are we afraid of? We've just come off in the story. If you take the context of John chapter 6, Jesus has just fed the 5,000, which if you remember from last week, if there's 5,000 men, there's probably another 5 or 10,000 more when it comes to women and children that were there. So the total number is at least 10,000, if not maybe 15 or 20,000, a huge group. And he feeds them all with just a couple loaves and a couple fish. An amazing miracle that his disciples saw firsthand as Jesus was breaking it, giving it to them, and they were breaking it. This miracle happened right in their hands as they gave out the fish and the bread. And what's interesting, right after this miracle is done, it says this in verse 15 of John chapter 6. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, notice that he withdrew to the mountain by himself. So he knew that people were so amazed by this miracle that they thought, man, this is the Messiah, or this is a prophet, this is a king. We're going to take him and make him king by force. They thought this was a good idea, God's plan. And Jesus knew, of course, this was not God's plan. So he withdraws by himself into the mountain, which sets up what's about to happen here. Look at verses 16 and 17. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. So Jesus goes up onto the mountain. He separates himself from the crowd. He separates himself from his disciples, and he goes up and withdraws to the mountain. So the question becomes, why did he withdraw? And there's a couple reasons for this, and one is to be alone with his Father, to be alone with God. He knew that they had been in a busy season of ministry. He had done a lot of teaching, he had worked a lot of miracles. There was a great crowd around him, and he wanted to be alone with his Father. He was also rejecting the crowd's demand. He knew that the crowd wanted to force him and make him king, and this was not God's plan, so he was going to reject that by saying no. He separated himself off from the crowd, went up onto the mountain to be alone with his Father, take that time, and then also, I think a third thing, he puts his disciples in a situation where they have the opportunity to grow.
And this is part of the setup here. This becomes very interesting because if we hop over to Mark's account in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 and 46, notice this. He gives a little bit different details. He says, immediately, talking about Jesus, he made his disciples get into the boat. I imagine the disciples did not want to do this. They probably wanted to stay with Jesus, stay around the crowd, see what was going to happen, but he makes them get into the boat and head to the other side. Very interesting. And then he goes up onto the mountainside and spends some time in prayer. But the key is here, he made them. And these guys being fishermen, or most of them fishermen, knew this lake. They knew this lake like the back of their hand. They understood the storms that could pop up at any minute and the dangers of it, and had been out probably in many storms themselves. But what's interesting about this is that the disciples were caught in the middle of the storm because they obeyed Jesus. Now, sometimes we get caught in the middle of the storm because we disobey Jesus. Anybody ever do that? Yeah. And sometimes because of our disobedience, we end up in a position that's not good, and we have a storm or chaos going around our lives because we didn't follow what he said. But sometimes we end up in a storm because we obeyed him. And Jesus wanted his disciples in this storm because he wanted to teach them a lesson. And so he sends them off by boat without him, and he takes his time to spend with the Father and then comes to them on the water. Matthew chapter 14, verse 25 and 26, Matthew gives us a few more details about what's going on. It says, now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a ghost, and they cried out for fear. Now these are men. Some of these are fishermen. They knew these waters. They'd been out on there many times, probably caught in storms before. And they're in this storm, and Jesus comes walking to them around the fourth watch. So this is probably around 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning, a time when I like to be asleep. And last night I was asleep. Was anybody awake last night between? So some of us, I know some of you told me beforehand you were awake during this time, sleeping right through it. But some of you were awake. I like to be sleeping during this time, and I'm sure you do too. But these guys are still rowing to this other side in the middle of the night or early morning. And so they're up, they're tired too. They had a long day, lots of miracles, being busy. Jesus puts them on the boat, sends them off, and still they're rowing this boat, probably fighting the wind and the current and the waves. And notice that, man, they are afraid. They are troubled, right? They see Jesus walking on the sea. They're troubled, and they don't even think it's him. They say it's a ghost. Could you imagine these guys? They're thinking it's a ghost. And then so much for, I love the way Matthew says this. They cried out for fear. They cried out for fear. You ever seen grown men cry for fear? I mean, like I know some of you guys have told me you hate bugs. You know, you get a bug in your eye, you'll scream like a girl. And this is what these guys were doing. I imagine they were screaming, and so they were afraid. This is probably one of Jesus' most famous miracles that he did. So it's interesting. Here's what happens. We get into a storm, and the disciples were in a storm, and their fear causes them not to be able to recognize Jesus. It kept them from recognizing Jesus. And I think for us, it's very similar. We get into a storm, and because of the fear of the storm, we have trouble recognizing Jesus. And I think that's why sometimes when we're in the storm, and I've said it, and I know other people have said it too, like, man, I'm in the storm, and I feel like Jesus is not anywhere near me. And the truth is, he is near us, but maybe what it is our fear of the storm has hindered us from recognizing him in the storm. And so that's what fear does to us. One of the things that fear does to us in the storm, it keeps us from recognizing him. And it happened to them, and it happens to us. The second thing it did, the fear also caused them to be afraid of Jesus. They were terrified of him. And I think sometimes this happens too, that we become afraid of him at times. Maybe he's causing this, or he wants something bad to happen to me. We think this, we become afraid of him. And it's just the opposite. We don't need to be afraid of him in the storm. In John chapter 6, verse 20 and 21, this is exactly what he said to them. He said this, but he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." And the most common command in the scriptures is fear not, right? Don't be afraid. Over and over, this is commanded to God's people in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because many times we're afraid. We're in a storm. We're in a situation. There's chaos. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. We're in over our heads and we're afraid and we are fearful. And Jesus comes to them and Jesus comes to us in the storms of life and says, don't be afraid. And notice in verse 21, it says, then they were willing to take him into the boat. Jesus gets into the boat with them. And it says, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So once he got in, it's like, boom, then they were at the shore. This becomes very interesting. Because if we go to Mark chapter 6, verse 51, we see a little bit different aspect of what happened. And when he went into the boat to them, notice this, the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. And the way it's in the Greek, it's like they were out of their mind amazed at what had just happened. But notice that the wind ceased. And what we actually have here, instead of just one miracle, I think what we have is like 4 miracles happening all almost at once. So you have your first miracle that you see Jesus, the disciples saw Jesus walking on water, right? And then the second thing, which isn't in John's text, but is in Matthew's text, we see Peter walking on the water. So in the story, John leaves that out, probably because he didn't want to tell this about Peter. He likes telling other stories about Peter, but I won't get into that. I'm going to stay on track here. But Matthew 14, verse 27 says this, but immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. And Peter answered him, you probably remember the story. He said, Lord, is it you? Command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. We have Peter walking on the water, but we know the story, right? But when he saw the wind was so boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hands and caught him and said to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? So we have one miracle, Jesus walking on water. We have a second miracle that Peter walks on water. We know the story of how that he was walking on water just fine until he started to look at the wind and the waves of the storm, and then he started to sink, and Jesus saves him. We have a third miracle that happens is the wind stopped. Like immediately this wind died down and left. And then the fourth one is they arrived immediately at the shore. So we had 4 miracles happening in this story. So as soon as Jesus got in the boat, boom, they were at shore. And what's interesting, if you look at each of these miracles, there's a lesson in each one that we could take one Sunday and literally just spend time talking about. Like Jesus walking on water, it's the power of his presence. And it's the lesson here that when life feels chaotic and there's waves all around us, we should focus on the one who can walk on the water, that he comes to the storm. And he's Lord over the circumstances. Jesus walked on water. The second miracle, Peter walks on water. This is like faith into action. It's the potential of faith in our lives, that when we trust him in the middle of the storm, it's amazing what God can and do. So there's a faith lesson here, the potential of faith when we keep our eyes on Jesus, right? And the idea is that fear sinks us, but faith continues keeping us walking on top of the storm. And then the third miracle, that Jesus stills the storm. And the lesson here is that Jesus has power over all of creation. Nothing is beyond his control. And the application of this is that we should trust him no matter what storm we're going through. Jesus is trustworthy, and he's got power over the storm. And then the fourth one, instantly arriving at the other side. The lesson that we have here is that the disciples were striving in their own strength to row this boat, to get it to where they wanted to go. Imagine they weren't making good progress. And Jesus gets in the boat and all of a sudden they arrive. And here's the idea, is that many times we're doing the right thing, moving in the right direction, but it's in our own strength and our own ability. And therefore we're struggling. And we should be allowing God's Spirit and God's strength to work through us to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. So many times we're going in the right direction, we're just working in our own power instead of relying on his power. And that's the lesson that we see in this last one, which is amazing. Now, here's the thing. The conclusion here, the idea with all these miracles that are taking place here, is the invitation that really Jesus is giving to all of us to trust in him. that he gives us an invitation to trust him no matter what we're going through. I don't know about you, but my biggest storms, my biggest fears have, when I finally gave them to Jesus, have been my greatest opportunities to grow as a person and develop. And I could list you off 3 or 4 things that I've feared through my life, and God has taken those as I was willing to hand them over to him. I mean, I held on to them for a while, for sure, no doubt about it, right? I said, nope, I'm keeping this one, and there's nothing you could do, and I'm afraid of this, and I don't want to face it. And this story is about us facing our fears, that Jesus will bring us face to face with our fears, but he won't leave us alone. He comes to us in our fears, and he gets in the boat with us in the middle of our greatest storms. And you know what he does? He stills the storm, and he takes us to the other side, that there is the other side of what we're afraid of. And many times we live on this side of our fear instead of allowing Jesus to take us to the other side of our fear. And what I've learned over the years with some of my biggest fears is when I was finally ready to give them to him and surrender and do what he asked me to do, to face my fear, that he took me to the other side of my fear, where there was great opportunity, where there was growth, and where that fear no longer mastered me, but I had mastered it. Now, was it still scary to me? Yeah, at times it was still scary, but I had learned to master it. And this is what he does to us in our storms and in our greatest fears. It's an invitation to trust. And the question becomes, are we struggling to walk by faith? Do we feel like we're trying to walk by faith, but we keep sinking? This is an invitation to trust. Peter was learning something about faith and trusting Jesus as he was walking on the water and looking at Jesus and then looking to the storm, and then he started to sink. And notice that when he called out for help, Jesus answered and gave him the help that he needed, and then gave him also a lesson in faith. And I remember the story of the man who his son was demon-possessed, and Jesus said, anything is possible to him who believes. And he says, help my unbelief. And Jesus did. Sometimes we're at that point where Jesus, help my unbelief. I'm struggling to trust. I'm struggling with faith. I'm struggling to trust you in this situation. Will you help me? Are we trying to walk by faith? Are we overwhelmed by the storm? Are we striving in our own strength instead of inviting Jesus into the process? This is the invitation for us today. This is what he invites us into today. Now, here's the thing, and we all struggle with this. I want to go back to Mark chapter 6, verses 51 and 52, because I find this so relevant to us and what they were going through. Notice what he says here again, and we read this earlier, but when he went up into the boat to them, notice that the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. And then I didn't give you verse 52. We read 51 earlier. Now, notice 52. For they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. This is what I find so interesting. They had just seen the loaves multiplied, a couple fish, a couple loaves, multiplied to feed over 5,000 people. They had just left from there. And now they're caught in a storm. And Jesus comes and they're afraid. And notice, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. I think many times we find ourselves in that same situation that the disciples were in, not understanding who Jesus really is. And that sometimes our hard heart doesn't see him in the midst of our storm, doesn't see what he wants to do. And I don't know about you, but I've been there many times. Am I seeing Jesus for who he is? Am I seeing him in this storm? And honestly, that's one of the hardest things to do, is to see him in the middle of the storm. But it is possible that we can, in the middle of our storm, focus our eyes on him and see him and not allow ourselves to, not understand. The disciples had seen the miracle with their own eyes. They had broken it and distributed the fish and the bread. They had picked up the baskets, 12 baskets, one for each disciple. And here they are in the storm. And I don't know about you, if you're like me, God can take me out of one storm, man, that was amazing, and I can get right into another storm. I'm like, I don't know how I'm gonna make it through this. Does anybody ever do that besides me? And it's like he's never brought you through anything before. And sometimes I fail to understand who he really is and what he can do. He just brought me out of something I didn't think I could be brought through. And now there's another storm in front of me, and I think that I'm hopeless and helpless and there's no way through. And we all do it. It's all of our struggle. And one of the lessons from this is the invitation to continue to trust even when we don't see it, even when we should see it. And thank God he doesn't throw us out when we don't see it, that he continues to help us and move us in the right direction. Will you stand with me this morning as we get ready to close in prayer? What's your storm this morning? What are you going through? What seems hopeless, helpless, beyond your ability, beyond what maybe you think even God can do? I think sometimes we got to look at our own heart. I need to work on my own heart. Lord, would you work on my heart? Help me to understand. Help me to see you for who you really are. Again, the Gospel of John is a gospel about belief. We are constantly seeing people move back and forth towards Jesus, away from Jesus, even his disciples struggling to trust him, even though they've seen his miracles over and over again. And we're not alone in it. They did it. We do it. The person beside you does it. We all struggle with that. But it's all something we can get better with. And God invites us, Jesus invites us to trust him. That when we think we're alone in the storm, that Jesus somehow comes walking to us. And we need to invite him into the boat and allow him to do the work that only he can do.